You cheated on me, didn't you? My husband, standing in front of me, yelled this while holding our newborn baby. I had just returned to the hospital room after giving birth, and he was accusing me. What are you talking about? I had no idea what he meant. I've been devoted to him since before our marriage, and I've never strayed since. I wondered why he would think that way, and I was angry that this was the first thing he said to me, who had just given birth. This baby's eyes are blue. You cheated with someone who has blue eyes, didn't you? That's impossible, I shouted back, despite the pain in my body. I couldn't understand his reaction, so I hugged our child again. The baby, with eyes still closed, suddenly opens his eyes. Beautiful, clear blue eyes met mine. How could this be? My husband and I both have eyes that are somewhere between brown and black. I've never seen such blue eyes before. I really didn't cheat. I have no idea why this happened. Stop pretending it's impossible unless you cheated. That's not true. I really have no idea. I gave birth to this baby, so there's no doubt this child is mine. I really couldn't understand why this baby had blue eyes. Do me a favor and get a DNA test. But if we did a DNA test, we could find out the truth about this child and my husband. As I desperately pleaded, my husband looked at me with suspicion. If this child isn't yours, I'll divorce you. I'll even pay alimony, but I really have no idea why this happened. This child is yours. Please, let's do the test. In the painfully silent hospital room, my husband's voice broke the silence. His response was, "My name is Lisa. I'm turning 29 this year. I work in an office jobs at a company in New York City. I was born in the Northeast and moved to New York for college, where I've lived ever since. I live with my husband, James, who is a year older and turning 30. James works for a sports equipment company. Growing up in a snowy region, I became skilled at skiing and joined a ski club when I started college. At that time, I met James, who was enrolled in the circle. James is from the East Coast and hasn't lived surrounded by snow like I have. But he's a natural sports enthusiast and fell in love with skiing during his high school trip. He often went to ski resorts and became quite skilled. We both had a strong interest in improving our skiing techniques, so we hit it off right away. We both participated in every ski trip the club organized, which gave us more opportunities to talk and grow closer. 6 months later, James expressed his desire for a serious relationship. That's how we became a couple, and our relationship progressed smoothly. After graduation, we both started working in companies in New York City. After I graduated, I moved into James's apartment and started living with him. The main reason we chose to live together was, of course, because we wanted to be with each other. But that wasn't the only reason. Before graduation, we had already discussed our mutual desire to get married someday. To make that happen, we needed a stable financial foundation. By living in James's apartment, I could save all the money I would have spent on my own rent, which would help us save for our wedding faster. With that in mind, we decided to cut back on our ski trips and focus on saving money until we reached our goal. As James and I both gained work experience and felt confident about our long-term careers, we finally achieved our savings goal. The first step was to greet each other's parents and obtain their formal approval for the marriage. It is difficult to go to my parents' house, which is far away, unless the two of us can take consecutive holidays at the same time. Since visiting my family in the Northeast required both of us to take a few days off, we decided to visit James' parents first. James had only revealed our relationship to his parents 2 months prior to this visit. His parents believe that couples should maintain a pure relationship before marriage. Where I come from, people have strong traditional views. My parents believe that any mistake between a man and a woman before a firm commitment to the future is unacceptable. James explained, "I understand growing up in a rural area in the Northeast. I know that the times feel different there, I replied. That's why you and I are supposed to be living in separate rooms. If they ask, let's stick to that story. With this understanding, we prepared ourselves to visit James's parents, making sure not to slip up and reveal that we were already living together. James's family runs a small woodworking shop and owns a factory adjacent to their house. The factory was originally started by James's grandfather, and his father is the second-generation owner. They have a few skilled craftsmen and create custom furniture and decorative items using locally sourced wood. Although the business is small, they have steady relationships with companies that have been around since his grandfather's time. The business isn't easy, but among their peers, they are considered fairly stable. When I was a kid, my dad used to say, "James, you're going to take over as the boss one day, so learn the job now." And he'd often make me help out in the factory. So when I decided to go to college, my dad wasn't too happy. "Who will take over the factory after your dad?" "No one yet. The current craftsmen are good at their trade but have no interest in managing the finances. We've tried to bring up younger people, but they didn't last long and quit. My dad still hopes I'll come back and take over one day." "Do you plan on coming back here eventually?" "No, I don't. I enjoy my current job related to skiing. Even if I change jobs, it has to be something connected to skiing, or I won't last." Knowing that James had no intention of taking over the family factory was a relief to me. Taking over the factory would mean I'd have to support it and settle down here permanently. I couldn't imagine living in an unfamiliar place, adjusting to James's parents' traditional mindset. During our first visit to James's parents, I met his parents, who would soon officially become my pill. We were seated at a table and greeted to each other. "I'm very happy to be with James, and I will do my best to support him." Okay. I had thought about and practiced my words for days, but my mother-in-law just gave a dismissive response. I felt a bit deflated. Still, it was better than nothing, since at least she responded. My father-in-law, however, remained silent and stern, making me worry that I had upset him somehow. But then James quickly started a normal conversation, so I figured that this aloof attitude was just their usual demeanor. "So, Lisa, what do you do for work?" My mother-in-law asked me a proper question for the first time. I expected her to start with something about my background or hometown, so the direct question about my job caught me off guard. Still, I explained that I worked in an office, and she immediately asked about my annual income, which left me momentarily speechless. "Is that something you ask your son's fiancé right off the bat?" James quickly stepped in, saying, "It's not polite to ask such direct questions." But then she continued with blunt questions about our rent, my parents' jobs, and the size of their property. It felt like she was trying to investigate my and my family's financial situation thoroughly. Honestly, I was getting quite tired of it. I glanced at James, who gave me an apologetic look. Given that James's family had run the factory since his grandfather's time, they probably had a very strict view on finances. The barrage of questions earlier might have been to check if anyone in my family had debts and if there was any risk of James getting involved. If they were trying to ensure that he wouldn't suddenly inherit a massive debt after marriage, I could understand that. At the time, I chose not to dwell on it. As soon as my mother-in-law finished speaking, my father-in-law spoke up as if he'd been waiting for his turn. "Let's go take a look at the factory." I was surprised by his words. Just when I thought my father-in-law had finally spoken, he was suggesting a factory tour. Of course, it's important to know about the family business of the man I'm marrying. But I could hear the sounds of the factory still running. I wondered if I'd have to greet the employees as well, which made me a bit nervous. As my father-in-law started to stand, saying, "You don't need to learn everything at once," James intervened. "Both of you, please stop. We only came to meet each other today. There's no need to show her the factory. Besides, why would Lisa need to learn anything about the factory? My father-in-law reluctantly sat back down, clearly displeased. James was right. It was obvious that my father-in-law's attitude implied he expected James to take over the factory one day, with my support. It seemed my father-in-law still hoped James would eventually inherit the factory. At this point, I began to feel a clear sense of caution toward my pill. Their blatant interest in my financial situation. The apparent attempt to bind James and me to the family business went beyond just being forward. It was a bit too much. While I couldn't avoid a connection with them if I married James, I started to realize I couldn't have a close relationship with them in my daily life. Sensing the tension, James wrapped up the conversation, saying we could continue it another time, and we ended the visit. As we were about to leave, my mother-in-law tried to say something to James in a low voice, and he responded with a weary expression. Finally, we were able to his parents' home. Later, I heard that my mother-in-law complained to James, saying, "Don't get so caught up in your marriage that you become estranged from your parents' home." Her words were blunt, but from mother-in-law's point of view, she may have felt as if I had taken James away from her, and she may have felt lonely. However, James seemed frustrated with both his father's expectation for him to take over the factory, his mother's demands for excessive contact. He didn't seem eager to meet them frequently. Their relationship wasn't hostile, though. His parents have strong personalities, but they are just acting that way because they care about James, and he also does not want to make waves with his parents. I wanted to respect James's feelings too, but after today's conversation, I clearly felt that I couldn't live a life of frequent interference from his parents. I told James how I honestly felt. I even mentioned that if there was a chance we'd have to live with his parents, getting married might be impossible. I love James, but I'm certain that living with them would soon make it impossible to stay calm. My parents sometimes impose their ideas unconsciously. I understand why you feel that way, James said. He promised that he wouldn't consider living with them in the future. Would ensure I wouldn't be subjected to interference by keeping our living spaces separate. I was really relieved because I didn't want to reconsider marriage at this point. However, even though we tried to limit contact, his parents didn't. Right after our visit, they began sending us various proposals that were more like demands. The most troubling of all was the sidetracking about the wedding. Since James is their only son, they insisted on following their traditional wedding customs. We had planned a small wedding at a church with only close family and friends. But James's parents wanted a ceremony in their local area and a larger reception to invite many relatives. This insistence finally broke my patience. I told James that I couldn't accept such interference with our important ceremony and asked him to stop them from making further demands. Although James felt the same, he looked distressed being caught between his parents and me, so I decided to compromise. I told his parents that we wanted to postpone the wedding to save more money, ensuring we wouldn't deplete our savings on the ceremony alone. And so, our married life began with the wedding ceremony still postponed. Most of our friends agreed that it was a reasonable and good choice. Although I regretted not having a wedding, I was overjoyed when we officially registered our marriage and I became James's wife in every sense. Our married life finally started. Daily life wasn't much different from when we were living together, but having a clear perspective on facing the future together was refreshing. We managed to avoid direct contact with his parents, so our relationship with them didn't worsen. 2 years passed quickly. I became pregnant with James' child and safely gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Returning to the hospital room from the delivery room, James came up to me, eagerly waiting to hold our son for the first time. I expected him to be overjoyed, and I was basking in the fulfillment of having given birth. But then I heard words that I couldn't believe. His eyes are blue. Why is this baby not mine? I didn't understand. Why was James glaring at me with such a harsh expression? Still groggy with exhaustion, I couldn't think of any reason. What are you talking about? He's your baby, James. What's the issue with his eyes? Take a look yourself. His eyes are blue. They're not my eyes or yours. You're the one who gave birth to him. So it must mean his father is a blue-eyed guy. Are you accusing me of cheating? I would never do that. Then why are his eyes blue? Both of us have brown eyes. I wanted to say something back, but a nurse who had rushed in due to the commotion stepped between us, and the situation calmed down for the moment. Later, after some time had passed, I talked to James again. On the surface, he seemed calm, but his eyes were still filled with suspicion. Most concerning of all, he wouldn't even attempt to hold our son. He thinks I cheated on him with a blue-eyed man and had his child. I would never betray him like that. But our son's eyes are indeed blue. And I can't explain why. You just don't want to admit you cheated. James accused. Please believe me, there must be a way to find out the truth. I pleaded, as I finally started thinking clearly. Realizing that a genetic test could prove everything, James's parents burst into the hospital room. Dad, Mom, how did you find out? James raised his voice in surprise. Knowing that I preferred to avoid seeing his parents, James hadn't even told them about my labor starting. Of course, he couldn't keep the birth itself a secret, but he planned to inform them only after mother and child had settled down. A nurse here is a friend of mine. She knows James, so she kindly informed us right away that our grandchild was about to be born. Not telling us about the birth of our first grandchild is disrespectful. Well, I was also quite shaken when you were born, so I get it. Both of them had the broadest smiles I had ever seen. Why are you looking so upset when your child has just been born? Yes, our child was born safely, but I found out he's not mine. That's why I'd be upset. James spat out. His parents exchanged puzzled looks, not understanding what he meant. Then his mother leaned over to look at the baby's face and cried out loudly, "It's true. This isn't James's child. His eyes, they don't look like my son's." My father-in-law was staring at our baby. "I've never seen a child with eyes like these," he claimed, and again he turned to me. "What is going on, Lisa? Were you planning to deceive James into raising a child with someone else?" "What a shameless woman. I thought you were distant when we met, but to think you were plotting this." "That's not true. There must be a reason for this. If we investigate, I'm sure we can find an explanation." The hurtful words thrown at me one after another were painful. But the worst part was seeing James, who was supposed to protect me, glaring at me along with his parents. The nurse, unable to bear it any longer, pushed my pill out of the room as they shouted, calling me a cheater and threatening divorce and alimony. She warned them that if they continued to disturb the patient's peace, she would call the police. Reluctantly, they quieted down and left. I fell from the height of joy at having our son to the depths of despair. After a while, my pill left and said, "I don't want to see the faces of other people's children." James sat silently, refusing to look at the baby in my arms. "I rushed here from work because you went into labor. What am I supposed to say when my colleagues congratulate me?" I never knew James could speak so cruelly. As I was unable to say anything else, James got up and was about to leave the room, and he said, "I'm not coming here anymore." Fear gripped me as I wondered if this was the end of our relationship and if our child would lose his father. "Wait, please. I understand it's hard to just believe me, but before you end things between us, please do one last thing for me." James reluctantly stopped. "Ask the hospital for a DNA test. It should take about a week to get the results. If the test shows he's not your child, then you can leave me." You can even demand alimony. But I swear, I didn't betray you. If you find out much later that he is your child, it will be too late to rebuild a relationship with me and your child." This final plea seemed to reach James, even if only a little. "Fine, the test will settle this." He said that as he left the room. After that, I wasn't in a state to talk to anyone. I told the nurse I couldn't see anyone until my parents arrived from my hometown, who I'd contacted as soon as the labor started. That night, my parents, who had rushed over by train, arrived just before visiting hours ended. The moment I saw their faces, I finally felt relieved to have my own supporters, and I burst into tears. "You did well," my mother said. "Where's James? Hasn't he come yet?" my father asked. I hesitated, wondering if I should tell them what had happened. But since I had done nothing wrong and the test would clear everything up, I decided to spare them the worry and stayed silent. I made the excuse that James had been with me but had to return to work for something urgent. Then my mother gently held my son, who neither James nor his parents had wanted to hold, and looked into his face. I wondered how she would react to his blue eyes. If she reacted like James and his parents, I couldn't bear to see that and looked down. "How cute! His features seem to resemble James's," she said. "Let me see, you're right. But his nose looks like you." Their reaction was very typical for grandparents seeing their first grandchild, simple, yet full of joy, and it made me incredibly happy. "Look, this baby also has blue eyes." "Yes, just like Lisa did." I looked up in surprise and asked them for a reason. I met my parents' loving and smiling faces. "My eyes were blue when I was born too." "Yes, didn't I ever tell you that?" "In our village, it wasn't that uncommon. We probably didn't think it was worth mentioning," my father added. I was baffled and asked for a detailed explanation. While my mother didn't have specific knowledge, my father had heard a more detailed explanation from a doctor friend. He explains that if parents have brown to black eyes, most of the babies born will also have brown or black eyes. But this is said to be due to the amount of melanin pigment in the eyes. However, there is a certain number of people who genetically have less. Because of this, there are cases where babies are born with blue eyes even though the parents have brown eyes. It seems that eyes that are blue at birth often become brown as melanin increases with growth, which is common. I was exactly one of those cases. Indeed, I had often been told by acquaintances that my eyes looked lighter. I used to have blue eyes, but they gradually turned brown, which probably makes my eyes look a little brighter than others. Since this wasn't unusual in my hometown, my parents never mentioned it to me as I grew up. However, my mother insisted she had told me a few times when I was little. If that's true, I must have just ignored it. But those details don't matter now. Understanding why our son has blue eyes and being able to explain it to James made me cry tears of relief. I suddenly started sobbing and my surprised parents held me by the shoulders. I leaned into their embrace and continued crying. Meanwhile, my son slept peacefully in his grandmother's arms. When I told my parents what had happened earlier, they were furious. I had never seen them so angry. They immediately tried to call James, who had gone home earlier. But since visiting hours were nearly over, my parents decided to go outside to meet James and left the hospital room. Later, I heard that my father had furiously confronted James and said, "How could you leave without believing a word your wife said or holding your own child?" James was reportedly very apologetic. My father explained the genetics of eye color, the situation in our hometown, and even showed James pictures of local children with blue eyes. This finally made James understand. My mother had to step in to prevent my father from being too furious. Hearing that James had apologized with tears in his eyes, I felt a bit relieved and my anger towards him started to ease. The next morning, James rushed to the hospital, having taken the day off work, and apologized for his behavior. "I'm sorry. I was convinced that if both parents have dark eyes, the child must have dark eyes too. I wrongly assumed that without one parent having blue eyes, a child couldn't have blue eyes." He explained, "It's okay. I didn't know or remember that my eyes were blue when I was little. Besides, we still don't have the DNA test results. I'm just glad you believe me now," I replied. James promised to clear up the misunderstanding with his parents and vowed never to let them interfere in our lives again. He called his parents, but when that didn't work, he went to their house to explain. However, they refused to believe me and insisted on waiting for the DNA test results, criticizing James for believing me too quickly. Despite James' efforts to explain that it's possible for blue-eyed children to be born to parents with dark eyes, his parents wouldn't listen. They even said that we were putting on an act with the neighbors and that James should leave me and take over the factory, so they could find him a better wife. His parents' lack of listening finally made James angry, and he stormed out. He told his parents if they continued to insult Lisa, he would insulate them. A week passed. Our son's health was perfect, and I had fully recovered from the initial shock of the incident. On the day my son and I were to be discharged from the hospital, the DNA test results arrived. James brought the unopened envelope to the hospital room and opened it in front of me. The results confirmed with a high degree of certainty that our son was indeed ours. James stared at the report for a long time before saying, "I'm truly sorry." Although I couldn't completely forgive him for the hurtful things he said, I understood that he had genuinely believed that a child's eye color always matched one of the parents. I had thought the same. If our child's appearance had been so different from mine, I might have panicked too. So, I couldn't bring myself to demand a divorce immediately. James apologized repeatedly and promised to explain the results to his parents. However, I no longer wanted any contact with his parents, even thinking it might be better not to tell them at all. If we leave this misunderstanding unresolved, my parents might try to use it to force us into a divorce. They're already gossiping to the neighbors. We need to make sure they know the truth," James said. Hearing this, I decided to leave everything about his parents to him and stop thinking about it. When James returned after making the call, he looked relieved. I explained everything to them and even took a photo of the test results and emailed it to them. I also told them not to come here and that we won't be visiting them. This made me feel that all connections with my pill were finally severed. However, as we were preparing for discharge and taking care of the paperwork, my pill showed up. They had taken a taxi immediately after the call. I heard James mutter under his breath, "Lisa, I heard the test proved he's James's son. That's great. Now everything's settled." "Yes, and he's a boy. Thank you for giving birth to a healthy baby boy," his father added. I was speechless. The expression "turning the tables" didn't even begin to cover it. Their attitude had flipped completely. These were the same people who had called me a cheater and urged James to divorce me and demand alimony just days ago. As I stood there in disbelief, James suddenly slumped to the ground, his shoulders sagging. "Shameless," I heard James mutter. He was so overwhelmed by his parents' selfishness that he couldn't even stand and seemed lost for a few seconds. Taking advantage of this, my mother-in-law slipped past James and came up to me. "Come on, let me hold him," she said, and was reaching out her hands. I instinctively stepped back. Then my father-in-law approached as well. "You and your children will probably outgrow the room when they grow up, so why don't you come and live with us? We have plenty of space and could even build an extension. A lively houses would make the grandchild happy too." I felt dizzy. I couldn't believe they were suggesting we live together. It seemed they had no sense of shame. It is no exaggeration to say that staying with these people any longer would impede my postpartum recovery. However, I didn't want to argue. No matter what I said, my pill wouldn't listen, and I didn't want my newborn to hear me shouting. I brushed off the hand of my mother-in-law, who was still persistently reaching out to hold my son, and went straight to the cab in which my pill were getting in, and looked them in the eye to let them know that I intended to get in. Recovering from his dazed state, James realized I wanted to leave immediately and helped me into the taxi. Pushing past his parents, who were standing there awkwardly ignored, James got in and told the driver to go quickly. The taxi sped off, leaving the hospital behind. I caught a brief glimpse of my pill staring in bewilderment in the side mirror, but I didn't look back. After receiving several calls from them, James finally answered in a cold voice, declaring our separation from them. "Mom, Dad, I don't want you involved in our lives anymore. It's unacceptable that you didn't even apologize to Lisa and then suggested living together. You won't see Lisa or our son. Don't consider him your grandson because you will never meet him." After hanging up, James immediately blocked their numbers on his phone. He simply told me that I won't be bothered by them again. Knowing his parents, I feared they might show up at our apartment despite James's strong declaration. However, I had no reason to worry anymore. Just before our son was born, James had been offered a job as a ski resort manager in the Northeast, thanks to a recommendation from a friend in his ski club. James had been ecstatic, eager to work in a field related to skiing, and accepted the offer immediately. The Northeast was my hometown, where my parents still lived. This opportunity provided the perfect conditions for both of us. Ideally, I would have given birth at a hospital in our new location. But my due date was fast approaching when James got the new jobs. It was too risky to switch hospitals at that point, especially since there were few hospitals in the area that handled deliveries and they were full of local expectant mothers. So I decided to give birth at the hospital where I had been receiving care. We planned to move to the Northeast once our son was old enough for long-distance travel. We kept the move and James's job change a secret from his parents, and soon we moved from New York to the Northeast. Everything was settled just a month after our son was born. He wouldn't remember living in a city apartment. Fortunately, he was healthy and the long trip to the Northeast went smoothly. During that time, James's parents never showed up at our apartment in New York. Years have passed since then, and we have had no contact with James's parents. My son, who is now running around energetically, continues to grow up not knowing the existence of James's parents. One day, I spoke with an acquaintance who lived near my pill. They told me that after we suddenly disappeared, James's parents were heartbroken to lose contact with their only grandchild and son. With his spirit weakened, my father-in-law couldn't manage the struggling factory and eventually decided to close it down. The factory, which he had hoped to pass on to James and then to his grandson, no longer exists. The acquaintance said they had seen my mother-in-law shopping a few times, looking completely lifeless. Eventually, my mother-in-law injured her leg, making it difficult for her to move and do household chores. My father-in-law, who had never done laundry in his life, was often seen wearing filthy clothes. Now, both the house and the factory are empty, completely abandoned. It is likely that the two of them, having lost the ability to care for themselves, were taken to a support facility for elderly people in need. Of course, I have no intention of checking on their whereabouts. Now, as ski resort managers, James and I are living our dream, working at a place we love. Being close to my parents' home allows us to visit and help each other when needed. My parents often come up with reasons to visit, eager to see their grandchild. Our son loves his grandparents and looks forward to seeing them. Having grown up around the ski resort, he naturally developed an interest in skiing. He often mimics skiing moves, making both us and his grandparents smile. I can't wait for the day he is old enough to ski with us. We look forward to that day with great anticipation.